Welcome to the Dusty Jobs podcast from Imperial Systems. Industry knowledge to make your job easier and safer.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Dusty Jobs podcast. We're glad you guys could all be with us. Today we have a very special guest, Chris Cloney. He's joining us remote. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you guys doing?
Oh, we're doing great. We typically have people in the studio, but Chris, you're actually located up in Canada, correct?
Yeah, you got it. I was in Nova Scotia up until 2 weeks ago, and now we're in Ontario. We just moved the whole family here, which is why I have a completely blank office with no furniture in it and sound echoey. But we're up here.
That's how it goes. You still probably have boxes laying all over the place, huh?
Yes, just not on camera.
There you go. Now, the reason we have Chris on today is Chris also has his own podcast. The name of your podcast is?
Dust Safety Science Podcast.
Dust Safety Science Podcast. Yeah, it's a phenomenal resource. We've been listening to it for a while here over at Imperial Systems. You've even had Jeremiah 1, the owner of our company, on your guys' podcast. And we're just glad to be able to talk to you today and learn a little more about what your podcast is about and how that might be a resource for some of our listeners to learn more and be educated and have a safer workspace. So, but Chris, before we get into all that, tell me a little bit more about how you even got started on this thing. What got you, because I know when I was in high school, my guidance counselor didn't come up to me and say, hey, one of the job options in the future is going to be a podcast about dust. That wasn't something that was on the board. So what journey took you to where you're at right now? What got you involved in all of this and got you interested in trying to teach people more about how to have a safer work environment?
Yeah, for sure. And if they did tell you that, they probably didn't say there were 2 podcasts on dust. So if you think there's one, then 2 is even more. I mean, yeah. I guess the best place to start is sort of who I am and where I'm at today. I'll let you do the same sort of thing with the Dusty Jobs podcast, because I think we're going to play this as a crossover on the Dust Safety Science podcast, and then people will know where to go. So my official title, I guess, Dr. Chris Cloney. I'm the owner of DustEx Research Ltd, and we're a company with a global focus on education, connection, change, and awareness for combustible dust safety. I'm the lead researcher there. I wear a number of hats, and we have a number of platforms related to combustible dust. So Dust Safety Science, which is where the podcast is hosted. We have the Dust Safety Academy for education, Dust Safety Professionals for connection. People can make requests there. Imperial Systems is a member company at Dust Safety Professionals, along with about 35 or 40 other companies globally. We help place those companies with end users that need them at the end of the day. So that's sort of where I am today. It wasn't quite in high school when I started, but it wasn't really that far off either. So maybe we'll get into that in a second, but I'll let you explain, what is the Dusty Jobs podcast for somebody that's listening to this on the Dust Safety Science podcast and wants to come over and check it out?
Sure, yeah. So the Dusty Jobs podcast is something we started new here at Imperial Systems. Our heart is to really just help get people educated on not just how to have a safer and cleaner and healthier work environment, but also just to give informational knowledge about, products that are out there, maybe services that can be done, more of the holistic idea of having a dust collector in your facility and what that can do for you. And we started as an educational resource so that people can know more about what we have available here at Imperial Systems, but also just for anybody out there who might be trying to figure out a little more about their own collector. We handle everything from filter information all the way up to service information. So we're still growing and figuring out our identity a little bit. We're a little bit newer into this. You guys have about, 200 podcasts under your belt? Is that right?
We're getting there. This, when it comes out, will be about 160 for our podcast. So
wow.
Going into our 4th year.
Right. So we're in our 2nd year. We have a little bit of a history, but not quite as much as you guys. So, but that's us. So you can see more on our website. We'll share at the end. ISystemsWeb.com is where you can go to really learn more about our company. And we have our own YouTube page where there's other videos that aren't just our podcast, but lots of other information on there about more of us. So.
And just to kind of to clarify, if somebody's listening to this on dust safety science and they're interested in the Dusty Jobs podcast, YouTube would be the best place to go to watch that, right? Because you play the videos and you have the whole thing. Right now you're recording.
Yeah, we have everything on our YouTube channel
as well.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, great place to look us up. So
cool. So so this will be interesting, hopefully, for the Dusty Jobs audience and listeners that are listening when this comes out, or listening if you're listening to this, a few years in the future. And I think it'll be interesting for the Dust Safety Science podcast audience too, to hear me be interviewed, to hear some of the background and some of the insights into what we're seeing with the different platforms that we're running. So Donovan, you asked about, how did I get where I am today, that we're even doing this interview? And it's a really great question. So I did my undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering. We have a thing called cooperative education in university here in Canada, where you can opt to work every 8 months in industry, make some money, which is really nice while you're a poor student, and get some experience. So my first co-op position was with a consulting company that was local in Halifax. I was looking at explosion and combustion science. So I was doing computer modeling, computational fluid dynamics, developing software to analyze fires and explosions. In particularly looking at defense applications. So, high explosives, improvised explosive devices, effects on troops and structures and ships, really trying to protect from things that go bang, quickly, release a lot of energy, doing things like, designing troop helmets to avoid traumatic brain injury, or designing tank armor to avoid improvised devices from being able to puncture the kind of hull of the tank and things like that. So it was a little bit more in the defense realm is where you started learning about explosions and what causes them and how they react and interact with things, right? Am I summing this up pretty good? Yeah, you got it. Blast, detonation, shockwave. When you see the Mythbusters blow something up, it's really large, and you see that nice kind of shockwave go through the air, and when they blow up a garbage truck or something like that, that's the sort of stuff we were doing, but on our computers and simulating it. So
that was like a kind of an internship, is a way to put it, right?
It was. So I did 3 of those over the period of a couple of years in university. We started up with that company afterwards. Worked there for better part of 6 or 7 years. But while I was doing that, I started my graduate research. And my graduate research was in dust explosions. So combustible dust, having it dispersed in the air. When it ignites, a deflagration can happen, which is the reaction front moving through the cloud that's in the air. If that's confined, you can have an explosion. And these are things that you see happen occasionally in dust collectors, we'll say, happen in processing vessels, happen in industries that are handling combustible solids. I thought it'd be the exact same. I thought it'd be the same as high explosive or C4 or things I were analyzing before. Turns out that combustible dust is completely different in terms of physics and chemistry, and a lot more challenging as well, and a lot less understood. So that was my foray into combustible dust. But the other half of that equation is I really looked at this as being something that was industry relevant. So, I'm doing this military application research, which is really great, but I felt like I could impact, the lumber mill next door, or the food processing facility down the street, or the rubber manufacturing facility, through my industrial application in combustible dust. And that's when I sort of started making the switch from, defense industries, military applications. Let's try to take that knowledge that's there and translate it into understanding these combustible dust explosions and what they mean in industry.
So was there something that happened in your personal life that you were like, I'm just interested in this more, or was it an actual professional application that you were like, I want to see what this is like, not just from this military and defense side, but you wanted to look into it, or was it just kind of trying to expand your horizons? I don't want to put any words in your mouth here. I'd love to know what made you go, I think I'd like to look into this more now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a couple things that sort of came together. One was just, again, working in defense industries for the better part of half a decade. I was looking for something that was new and more, well, not that I can talk to people at dinner parties about dust explosions really, but if you think you can't do that, talking about designing helmets for traumatic brain injury and stuff is even harder, trust me.
Right.
so that was one part. I had a fantastic supervisor in Nova Scotia, Dr. Paul Amiot. Very well known and respected in the field of combustible dust and process safety. Inherently safer design and hierarchy of controls are sort of four of his main areas. So he was just starting a nice sized research project with a number of master's students and PhD students that was also brought on by industry. So we had 4 or 5 industry partners. So sort of like this little collective of combustible dust in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The third piece is that we actually had quite a large coal mine explosion in 1992. So I won't exactly date myself, but I was, less than 10 years old when that explosion happened. It was only about half an hour from my house. It took the lives of all 26 miners at the time. So something like that, it wasn't in my community, but the community it was in, they're still reeling from it today. No more jobs, large employer gone. 26 families with 26 missing sons or fathers, depending on the age, and there was that whole range. So when I started thinking about that, it's like, wow, this is something that can actually impact what we're doing day to day more than the military defense applications. So those 3 things kind of came together to really start me down the path of, okay, well, let's talk about combustible dust and industry relevant applications with that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some personal exposure, some professional exposure, and then just kind of the right place at the right time with that fellowship that was happening with those people. That's very interesting.
Fortuitous.
So, yeah, there you go. So then what got you started in your podcast? I mean, this is really where we're both at right now. We're talking about this. So you went from doing this research to, what made you say, man, I want to get this out there so other people can be hearing about it and learning about it? What caused you to do that?
Yeah, so I had about 2 years left in my PhD when I sort of got started with this, and I had traveled around the world to multiple countries to talk about combustible dust in my research. Countries like Poland and Norway and here in the United States, and I kind of I realized a couple things at once. So I think there's sort of 2 scenarios at once. I was doing this really what I thought was awesome research, we'll say, really interesting research in the physics and chemistry of dust explosions. But if I talked to an industry person, like it didn't really, sorry, what I say, it didn't really resonate. It was like I was looking at different questions than they wanted answered. So the different stakeholders in combustible dust, and you have researchers, you have end users, you have equipment suppliers and manufacturers, insurance, government, inspectors, research institutions like, say, the Chemical Safety Board or others. I kind of saw that there's all these groups, but nobody hung out together. No one spoke the same language. No one was asking the same questions. And even worse, no one was really answering the questions that the other stakeholders had. We are sort of in our own their own spheres.
Their own silos. Everybody's in their own silos of information and interests. And nobody was putting them together, huh?
Exactly. So that was sort of scenario 1. And then scenario 2 was just when I looked at loss history, it was always either you weren't aware of the hazard, you didn't have the right knowledge and education to defend against the hazard if you were aware of it. And if you had those 2, you didn't know who to talk to get your solution solved.
Right.
So it was awareness, education, and connection, which oddly enough, now when I look back 5 years and we've created all these platforms, it's one communication platform for awareness, that's the podcast, one education platform, that's the Dust Safety Academy, and one connection platform, that's Dust Safety Professionals. So it's like these 3 gaps were the things that were needed to progress safety moving forward.
Yeah, because some people out there might not even know they're in a situation where they need protection. Some people might be in a situation where they need protection, but they're not sure how to get it or exactly what that looks like. And some people might be, just trying to figure out how to, if they are in a situation where they're just trying to get an education on, is what I'm doing daily in my workshop going to cause me or someone else harm? And,
you got it.
Yeah,
we say 4 pillars: awareness, knowledge, connection, and change. So you got to be aware of the hazard. You got to know what is, so it's not downplayed. You need to know who you can go to solve your problem. And at the end of the day, you need the tools to be able to elicit change, whether that's cultural change, whether that's change about money spent in your organization, whether that's change in government organizations and their interpretation or approaches. they all sort of drive to that pointing end of the spear to actually making facilities safer. I should have said this at the outset, but Dust Safety Science and DustEx Research, our mission, our vision for what we're doing in the world is to see a year with zero fatalities worldwide by 2038. So within 20 years of creating the company. And that's sort of the underlying thing that's the lens we look at everything we do with. Would this project, task, platform, discussion thing we're doing next contribute to potentially reducing a life lost from combustible dust explosions? And this discussion will, because it's a new audience, it's a new group to show what kind of things we're creating to educate folks and connect folks.
Yeah. So that's kind of where the podcast came from and where it is currently and all the different platforms in which you can get educated and get connected. So when we're talking about that and we're thinking about that, what do you think the future of, like, well, let's talk about where the industry used to be when you started this to where we are now, because I think every year we're getting safer. We're putting things in place. There is more education. There is more resources. There's more knowledge on what helps industry, individuals, people. What would you say is the biggest thing you've seen over the time you've been doing this that's really changed the most in the industry?
Yeah, it's interesting, and we sort of had a conversation about this before. There is a lot of activity right now on combustible dust, and it's really important to see. And it's really, great to see. And when I think back, the most recent, I call it the most recent renaissance in combustible dust, dates back to 2006 with the release of a report by the Chemical Safety Board. It's something like the Combustible Dust Report. I can't remember exactly what the title is. They released a report that looked at 3 incidents in 2003. West Pharmaceuticals, Hayes Lemmers, and CTA Acoustics that were all major multi-fatality incidents. They released that report in 2007, so a year later, OSHA came up with their new national emphasis program for combustible dust. Literally, while that was sitting on the desks and been distributed at companies throughout the United States, including Imperial Sugar, so that was released in October 2007. Imperial Sugar happened in February 2008. And they found memos internal to Imperial Sugar talking about the national emphasis program and not connecting the dots that could apply to them. And that explosion, killed 14 workers and injured 36.
And that could have potentially been even bigger, but during the time frame when that happened, luckily there wasn't as many people working.
Yeah. And so then we have a whole bunch of things that have happened since then that are really important to discuss and important to talk about and important to push forward. But to look back a little bit, it's kind of interesting to see the history. And I've often thought that maybe I should write a history book on combustible dust. But the first regulation for sugar dust came out in 1924, regulations of the National Board of Fire Underwriters for the pulverizing systems for cocoa and sugar. And the introductory paragraph is, these regulations are issued to eliminate or reduce hazards inherent in the manufacture of pulverized sugar, particularly a hazard of its ignition. It is essential that there should be no escape of dust into the atmosphere of the room, a condition favorable to a dust explosion and rapid propagation of fire. That was in 1924.
In 1924, they knew they should be collecting this stuff, and it was hazardous at that time.
And so I'll read you some, I'm not going to go through it. Well, I've already went through a bit of a diatribe, but I'm not going to go too much. But there's a section on housekeeping. Good housekeeping is one of the most important factors. Apparatus which will not leak and permit the escape of dust or sipping out of cocoa, because it covered cocoa and sugar, is essential. All dust collectors, here another section, all dust collectors shall be constructed through non-combustible materials. All dust collectors, if used in connection with the pulverizing system, if not located outside the building, shall be located within the pulverizing department and shall be properly vented to a safe point outside the building. I mean, it's 100 years ago. So the reason I bring this up is there's actually been at least 3, maybe 4 renaissance of combustible dust just in the United States. There's this most recent one, 2008-ish. 1970 to 1980, there was the grain handling standard that was created after a number of grain silo explosions. In particular, they had, I think, 5 in a 3-month period that killed 70 or 80 workers in 1977. That was the second most recent one. The one before that is the 1920s. that was actually driven by insurers. They were seeing all their insured facilities blow up, and that's why they came up with this standard. Like, well, we got to stop this. And then there's probably at least one more with coal mining in the United States in the late 1800s. So we see these peaks and valleys and peaks and troughs. But the most interesting part is that every country and every industry goes through these peaks and troughs at different times. So just in the last 3 years, there was a large explosion in Port of Aqaba in Jordan. We covered that on our podcast on episode 13. So 130 episodes ago with Ali Al-Nashdawi, who is the incident investigator. That caused them to audit all of their silos in the country of Jordan and try to come up with a grain handling standard. Same thing happened in Zimbabwe that same year. This year, we had an explosion in Singapore that so the explosion involved potato starch. It happened in February.
Right.
By March, they had inspected 500 companies in Singapore on combustible dust. And by May, they come out with SS 667 2020 Code of Practice for Handling, Storage, and Processing of Combustible Dust. So every country and every industry is going through these waves at different times. And the real big challenge at the end of the day, and the reason I go through the big diatribe, is we tend to rewrite the whole thing from scratch every time, not realizing that the stuff was created before, or the stuff is created in another country. Instead of translating knowledge, translating information, we're sort of net writing new. And that's why I love the podcast. That's why I love the Dusty Jobs podcast too. It's all about how do you take these experiences and translate them from one to another, which is much more effective in facilitating change than writing another, I don't even want to say writing another standard combustible dust. There's probably a ton of them going on right now, but then writing something that's net new. Translation is better than doing that.
Yeah. And you're right. There's so much knowledge, so much information out there that we can share now. And with the internet and with all the different resources we have, we can take that information that we've already figured out in some situations and transfer it into other ones. And I think that's what we're trying to do here is, give people, we don't want a tragedy to happen which causes people to go look for an answer. We're trying to help provide answers before that happens so that we can avoid more tragedies in the future. And I think that's the heart of what you guys are doing, the heart of what we're doing here. So what do you think the future of the industry is? I mean, do you think there's going to be more of this, hopefully cross-cultural information that's getting shared and that, or what do you see? What do you see the future of dust collection and safety industry? Where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the future a bit, and while we do that, I'll pull up some other notes about some maybe words of caution in the current global system that we're in. So the future-looking sort of notes are that, just like you said, the biggest thing is to avoid the trough. So we know that we go through peaks and valleys. There's a couple ways we can solve that. One is to work collaboratively with other industries and other countries, so that the whole global community doesn't go through a trough at the same time. When Singapore is creating new standards like they are this year, literally right now they're training their country on these new standards. Well, then maybe we should be listening, and maybe we should be working with them here in North America or in Canada or in Argentina or wherever it is. So just allowing that global communication to happen from one group to another sort of eliminates or smooths out all these peaks and valleys everyone's going through. And just talking about sharing the stories also gets rid of those peaks. So if we can make this most recent renaissance the last one that goes down again, everybody forgets about it until something bad happens, then I mean, that's really the solution. There's lots of technological things going on. I call it the dust safety hexagon. If we need another geometric shape in our world, which some people would say maybe we don't, but it's two sides with three on each side. So contain, collect, clean. That's how you prevent explosions outside devices. Contain it inside the processing vessel. Collect it at point sources where you can't, and clean up any dust that remains. And then prevent, protect, isolate. Those are your technological solutions, how to prevent explosions inside and outside equipment. There's a whole bunch, there's hours and hours of discussion to be had on all of those topics.
Oh, yeah. And there's tons of products to help with all of that too. Products and procedures that can help for the guy who's out there listening to this and just going, wow, there's I'm getting flooded with information. There's a lot of spots you can start with just, even if you're just looking at a pile and go, man, there's a lot of sawdust underneath this. I should probably sweep it up. Or there's this shouldn't be sitting around the collector. The collector should be collecting the material. If you have a leak in your collector, that's a good secondary ignition source that, you should be collecting. So for just the guy who's out there listening, maybe doesn't have everything figured out, but there's definitely places you can start. And I think that's what we're thinking about in the future, helping people find a starting point that they can start moving forward through. And, listening to some of your information and some of the stuff we've had on in the past here, that could be a really good place to start. If you're listening to the first time, you're going, man, I haven't even thought about some of this stuff. That would be a great place to start, is maybe going back into some of the topics that you guys have covered and we've covered, getting connected with your group socially, with the connections that you guys have and some education that you guys can provide on just how to handle some of that stuff. But
I couldn't agree
more.
I think
you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. We're just going to see some waves keep going, but hopefully our future is getting that information out there so everybody can use it together. And we can try to help other people prevent making some mistakes that have already happened in other areas.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the key, if you want to change someone's behavior, is to have the right message at the right time, using the right language that they use in their own head. So if it's not the right language, they won't care. If it's not the right message at the right time, they also won't care. So if there's someone that works at a sawmill right now and they have dust throughout the entire facility, which actually is pretty common. I'm willing to bet if there's 10 people that are working in sawmills and listening to this podcast, 7 of them have this currently at their facility. You go to dustsafetyscience.com/2. Our second podcast episode is lessons learned from 2 sawdust fires at a New Brunswick lumber mill. You can go to, in 2012, we had 2 lumber mill explosions in British Columbia that were both multiple fatality explosions back to back at different sites, like hours apart. So after the first one, people were saying, oh, this never happens, right? Like it was completely discounted. And then another one happened. And that's really influenced WorkSafe BC, WorkSafe British Columbia's approach to combustible dust. They've really taken a proactive approach over the years. Just a few years ago, there's a very large lumber mill explosion in the UK, and the owner of the mill is up for manslaughter charges right now. I think the trial just finished. So those 7 out of 10 people, there's a couple resources to think about when you start, trying to, when that creeps in your head that, oh, this won't happen here, oh, this can't happen here. It's just, they're infrequent events. And that's the biggest challenge, is to keep that level of, what do they call it?
Complacency?
Yeah, the opposite of complacency.
It can't happen to me.
Yeah, try to keep that level of susceptibility
urgency
high. Like that you still feel that, okay, this is a possibility here. Because I guarantee everyone that's ever been injured, and we've talked to a lot of them on the Dust Safety Science podcast, in an explosion. Unfortunately, we don't get to talk to the people that don't make it. But we do get to talk to their families, and we've had several interviews with like that on the podcast. But nobody that was in a dust explosion went to work that day thinking, hey, this is the day, or they just wouldn't have went. So nobody thinks that this stuff's going to happen. They all think, it's not going to happen to me, or they don't have the awareness, the knowledge, the connection, or the ability to make change at their facility. If they thought,
but that's what we're here to do.
They would stay home.
Yeah, that's what you're here for. That's what we're here for, to try to help people prevent that from happening. We don't want anybody's day at work to be their last day at work unless they're retiring. That's it. So, but Chris, I just want to say thanks for coming on. Is there anything else you want to share about where people can find you guys, or where they can learn more about what you got on? I know this isn't going to be the last time we're going to have you on here. We'll probably have you on for a couple deep dives into some topics that we can really talk about, and maybe get into more wood dust or something like that. I know we're hoping to have you on again to talk about more specifics, but it was great getting to know you and introduce you to our audience. And hopefully your audience is going to feel the same about what we're doing over here. But what's some places some people could find you or reach out to you or look for you online or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing, because I know this audience is tuning into a podcast already, is just go to the Dust Safety Science podcast. You start at one. We got about 200 hours probably of material on there. So you start at one and start working your way through. If you have a lot of driving in your job, it's probably more effective to start searching through topics and find one that's relevant to you. So whether or not it's a story from a worker who's been involved and you're a health and safety manager and you want to understand that scenario, if it's a technological issue, our podcast goes into the details. So we'll cover things like, what do you do if there's too many concrete silos too close together? How do you protect that system? How do you, and then everything. We have stuff from, education and history, and we talk about after 150 episodes, you really got to diverse what you're talking about. So that'd be the best place to go, though. Dust Safety Science podcast. If you need help and support at your facility, if you need a dust hazard analysis done, which we didn't even talk about, it's hard to imagine we just did a whole podcast on combustible dust in North America and didn't say DHA at least once, but we'll talk about that in the next one, I'm sure. If you need DHA, you need testing, anything like that, Dust Safety Professionals, if you go there, we'll get you set up one of our member companies just in a matter of hours or days for getting your project moving. So those are the best place to catch me.
Great. Yeah, and if you're more interested in dust hazard analysis, I'm sure you guys have some podcasts on those. We have a podcast in the past about dust hazard analysis, so you can go back and look that up. And if you're like, what does that even mean? You can go back and see what that's all about. But that's a really important thing. I just want to say thanks for coming on. Thanks for everything that you guys are doing over there. We appreciate it. And we're looking forward to having some more conversations with you. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We're on all of those. So thanks for tuning in to the Dusty Jobs podcast. Everyone out there, just stay healthy and stay safe, and we'll look forward to talking to you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Donovan. Appreciate the work that Imperial Systems is doing and appreciate this podcast. Keep it up.
You too, Chris.
Thanks for listening to the Dusty Jobs podcast. Breathe better, work safer.